Welcome back to our continuing study of the history of modern missions. Today we're going to be looking at the Great Century, the 19th century in missions. Following the work of William Carey, as the world moved into the 19th century, Steve Neal notes, in 1800 it was still by no means certain that Christianity would be successful in turning itself into a universal religion. But later on, reflecting on what happened in the 19th century, Kenneth Scott Latourette called it the Great Century. In fact, 3 volumes of his 7-volume History of the Expansion of Christianity is dedicated to the 19th century. So what happened? Why were Protestant missions so successful in the 19th century? Ruth Tucker has identified at least 7 causes for the rapid growth of the evangelical church during this period. First, it was a period of decline for non-Christian religions. Globally, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam were all facing the onslaught of the West and lost their confidence and began to shrink. Similarly, there was a decline in Roman Catholicism. The French Revolution had cut off financial support for Catholic mission work, and also, again, there was just a general loss of confidence. It was an era of relative world peace, and so there was freedom for Protestant powers to move around the globe. It was a period of secularization as the Enlightenment was spreading around the world, evolution ideas were spreading around the world, religions were declining, as we've already mentioned, so there was just a beginning to look at the world in a different way and question long-held beliefs. And so this made an openness for people to hear new ideas, including evangelical Christianity. There were evangelical revivals spreading a sense of responsibility for world evangelization. As we look at some of the people that we're going to talk about in a moment, you're going to see how they came under the influence of great preaching and a powerful movement of God throughout, particularly the United Kingdom and the United States. Also, we're going to see that mission societies were being formed to create an avenue for mission service so that there was a mechanism for those who felt called to go abroad and to spread the gospel. Also, we'll be talking a little bit about colonialism and the Industrial Revolution, as those both opened doors for travel to places that were before unreachable by most Protestants. So let's take a look at these factors in more detail, beginning by looking at the development of mission agencies. There were British agencies. As I say, there was this great revival movement happening in the United Kingdom and an awareness of the need for missions, an influence of William Carey and the work that he was doing. And so English Baptists organized in 1792 to support the work begun by William Carey. And not to be left behind, the London Missionary Society was formed in 1795. It started out as a non-denominational agency, but quickly became the support arm for British congregational missions efforts. And then again, not wanting to look like they weren't as concerned for the things of the Lord as the other agencies, the Church Mission Society, or the Anglican Evangelical Church Mission Society, as its full name is, was established to send Anglican missionaries. Across the pond in the United States, American agencies were also being formed. First, we have the Haystack Prayer Meeting in 1806. Aware of what had been happening in England in terms of the Protestant missions movement, a group of students from Williams College in Northwest Massachusetts gathered to debate theology and pray about their responsibility in world evangelization. A thunderstorm broke out. They took cover under a haystack, and they finished their time of prayer with a firm commitment to help American Christians advance the cause of Christ globally. Growing out of that meeting, we see the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions was established in 1810. It was formed to organize the work first to send out students and then others, and in the first 50 years of its existence, over 1,250 missionaries were sent, including Adoniram Judson and his team. In 1814, we see the establishment of the Triennial Convention or also known as the American Baptist Foreign Mission Society. In 1812, Adoniram and Ann Judson and Luther Rice had been sent by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, the Congregationalists who practiced infant baptism, to join William Carey in the work in India. As Rice and Judson were on separate ships, they began studying Scripture so they could prove Carey wrong on the doctrine of believers' baptism by immersion, but both became convinced that Carey was correct. Once they arrived, they shared their decision and were baptized, but then they realized they had just lost their jobs as congregational missionaries. And under the advice of Carey, the Judsons moved into Burma, what we now know of as Myanmar, And Rice returned to the United States to develop a support network for them. And so the American Baptist Foreign Mission Society was born. This group met every 3 years and is commonly referred to as the Triennial Convention. In 1820, Judson saw his first convert. In 1840, the Bible was completed in Burmese, and in 1850, Judson died, having been preceded in death by 2 wives and 4 children. In 1845, the Southern Baptist Convention was established as a reaction by Southern churches who resented the influence of Northern Baptist churches and their refusal to appoint slaveholders as missionaries. Its first action was to establish the Foreign Mission Board, and the first 2 countries where Southern Baptist missionaries were sent were China and Nigeria. We're going to talk more about the Southern Baptist Convention and the history of the Foreign Mission Board later. But as mission agencies continued to multiply, so did the problems. New believers were confused by multiple versions of the gospel, and mission workers often found they were redundant in some fields while others were being underserved. So comity agreements were an attempt by mission agencies to solve these problems. Much as Western governments had divided the globe into colonies, mission agencies made agreements over which agency would work in which territories. Churches from other nations began to respond, and by the middle of the 19th century, there were evangelical Protestant mission sending agencies from Germany, Switzerland, Denmark, France, Sweden, and Norway. All of this was led by the influence of the work of William Carey, and it is for this reason he is known as the father of the modern missions movement, because it wasn't governments sending out missionaries, it was mission societies. So, what was the impact of colonialism in the 19th century on the expansion of the gospel? The Industrial Revolution began in England in the late 1700s. Improvements in manufacturing processes, including the development of the steam engine, allowed British to develop a factory system for the mass production of goods. One consequence of this development was increased wealth, including the birth of the middle class. Another was the need to find raw materials needed to fuel the factories of Europe and markets to buy the goods that were being produced. Combined with a populace at peace and steamships that could circle the globe more safely than ever before, colonialism gave rise to the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution led to more colonialism. Terry and Gallagher, in their book Encountering the History of Missions, define colonialism as the establishment of colonies in the majority world by Western nations between AD 1492 and 1950. Western powers established colonies in order to exploit weaker nations' economically established world political empires. Colonialism is the Protestant version of the methods we saw the Catholics using in the Roman Empire and Christendom in the Middle Ages. These power encounters were military powers being used to open up regions to the gospel. As these Western powers began to develop colonies, they sent citizens as soldiers and merchants. Chaplains were sent first to care for the needs of the expat community. Later, the needs of the local people came to be known back in the home country, and missionaries would be sent, or at least called by God when the facts were known. Often, however, the greatest obstacle to the missionaries' call were the business and government leaders who were afraid the missionaries would upset the national community or seek to prevent the exploitation of the local population. And so this colonialism was an opportunity to bring the gospel to places where it could not be known, but it was also related to the violation of the human rights, the basic human rights of many people in the world. And so obviously colonialism was not all good. However, there were some exaggerations about the negativity of colonialism. It's a mixed bag. Colonialism in missions is a multifaceted issue. It did do a lot of harm, and it is not always the case that the missionaries were walking arm in arm with the colonialists. Often they were walking in opposition to them. In a discussion on colonialism in a doctoral seminar I was leading, a Nigerian student observed, I will say largely, missionaries challenged colonialism in Africa. Looking at the rear view of missionary work in Africa, the major problem why it was difficult for Africans to recognize this fact in those years was that there were few distinctions made between missionaries and colonial masters or even merchant people. To Africans, missionaries and colonial masters both represent one another, or simply put, all we see is color. If they all have the same color, they have the same agenda, and they possibly complement one another. But the truth is, the missionaries fought against most of the demeaning actions of the colonial masters against Africans. On the other hand, that is not to say there were no missionaries who supported the colonial masters. Few of the missionaries did. Also, there were missionaries who were caught in the web of trade and slave trade who eventually lost their missionary focus for personal gain. Stephen Neal, an Anglican missionary to India and brilliant missions historian, has noted that missionaries tried to make the best of a situation they would not have freely chosen. Others, seeing some good in occupation by a Western power, were prepared to accept it for the sake of the good, and sometimes to turn a blind eye to the evil. Indeed, by the year 1900, most missionaries were not serving in colonies, and the ones who were spent much of their effort to oppose harsh colonial policies in defense of the national population. Andrew Walls has observed the relation between missions and colonial expansion is complex, but one thing is clear. If missions are associated with the rise of imperialism, they were equally associated with the factors which brought about its destruction. In their book, Encountering the History of Missions, Dr. Mark Terry and Robert Gallagher identify both positive and negative aspects of colonialism. In terms of the positive, colonizers encouraged missionaries to advance with them, bringing the gospel to new locations. They provided security for missionaries in dangerous locations, and they expedited the work of missions. However, the negative side is there was an abuse of power, which gave a false impression of the gospel, and some people were drawn by that power of the colonialists more than by the power of the gospel. Missions became identified with the colonial power, and when the colonialists were expelled, so was the church. This experience is definitely what happened in much of South Asia. Now I want to turn our attention to who some of the missionaries were who were serving in the early days. Far too many examples exist to give any country or agency the credit they deserve. I'm just going to highlight a few people from different parts of the globe to give you a flavor for what was happening. You may want to use one of these as a spark for selecting the biography for your book report if you haven't already done so. We've already talked about William Carey and the Serampore Trio in India, Judson and Rice and the work in Burma. Now we're going to look at some people working in Africa, China, and the Americas. In Africa, missionaries saw their role as one of fighting the slave trade, opening trade routes, providing medical care, as much as it was bringing the gospel. We're going to talk about this more as we look at David George, Lot Carey, Robert Moffat, David Livingstone, and Mary Slessor. David George lived from 1743 to 1810. He was a runaway slave, served as the pastor of the first all-African-American church in the United States. He also served as a missionary in Canada before he planted the first Baptist church on the continent of Africa. The Sierra Leone Company was formed by British philanthropists and abolitionists to send former slaves to Sierra Leone where they could resettle, free from the prejudice and dangers that they faced in North America. George became a leader in that movement and was part of a group of nearly 1,200 former slaves who traveled to West Africa. And while en route, he led many of his co-passengers to faith in Christ. And soon after arriving in Freetown, he built a meeting house and began having baptisms. And that began 20 years of service in Sierra Leone. His autobiography is one of the most important of the early slave narratives. Lot Carey, 1780 to 1828, was another man born into slavery who became a missionary pioneer. Born in Virginia into a Christian family, Carey did not become a Christian himself until he was an adult. After his conversion, he began preaching to other slaves in the Richmond area before becoming the pastor of the African Baptist Church of Richmond. By the time he was 33, he had earned enough money contracting out his labor that he was able to buy his and his children's freedom, and in 1815 he played a crucial role in the development of the African Baptist Missionary Society. In 1821, Carey, his wife and 2 children, along with 28 members of his congregation, went to West Africa, an area that became Liberia, and he served as a missionary of the Baptist Board of Foreign Missions. After arriving in Liberia and establishing the church with people from the U.S., Carey began ministering to locals. While many nationals saw the church members as colonialists, about 60 Africans joined the church within the first 2 years. Unfortunately, Carey was killed in 1828 in an accidental explosion. Robert Moffat came from a poor family, was raised as a Scottish Congregationalist. In order to make a living, he became a gardener, and later the London Missionary Society sent him to South Africa to do agricultural work. He established a missionary compound in Kuruman, South Africa. He was one of the first to see the need to use the language of the target people, and he translated the Bible into the Setswana language of the people he was serving. He endured many great hardships, but he underestimated the power of the African traditional religion and never quite seemed to understand the worldview of the Botswana people. As important as his impact was in South Africa, even in his own lifetime, he was best known as being David Livingstone's father-in-law. No summary of the missionary endeavors of Africa would be complete without mentioning one of the most famous missionaries of all time, David Livingstone. Born in Blantyre in 1813, Livingstone studied both theology and medicine with the hope of one day being a medical missionary in China. However, by the time he was appointed to the London Missionary Society, a political dispute between China and Great Britain forced him to find another field of service, and in 1840 he sailed for the Cape of Africa. Upon arrival, In Cape Town, Livingstone became increasingly anxious to set out into the interior of Africa in search of the thousands of villages where the name of Christ had not been named. Honestly, that desire was as much for a heart for the nations as a desire to be away from other missionaries who were getting on his nerves. He was an excellent explorer and a decent missionary. He wanted to combine Christianity and commerce and was opposed to the slave trade. He felt if he could help develop industry in Africa, there would be less of a role for slavery. He spent most of the remainder of his life exploring the vast grasslands, rivers, lakes, jungles, and deserts of Africa. Upon his death, natives buried Livingstone's heart in Africa as a sign of his love for Africa and the African people's love for him. The rest of his body was shipped back to England, where it was buried in Westminster Abbey in London. Mary Slessor was one of the many people who read the exploits of Livingstone and felt a tug to go to Africa with the gospel. She was a red-headed working-class woman from Scotland who described herself as a wild lassie. Raised in poverty as part of a large dysfunctional family, she found solace in the church and in ministry. She worked tirelessly in the inner city, confronting street gangs and presenting Christ. In 1875, she was appointed by the Calabar Mission to serve as a missionary near modern-day Nigeria. The work was difficult and slow, but she persisted, constantly pushing further inland. After the death of her mother and two sisters, she said, "Heaven is now nearer to me than Britain, and no one will be anxious about me if I go up country." So for the next 25 years, she served in the remote area of Okoyong, for a time serving as a judge for the community. She was accused of quote-unquote going native for moving into a mud hut and dressing like nationals. In 1903, she had her first baptism service of 11 converts. 7 were children she had taken in as her own. But when she died, the door had been opened, and several mission agencies continued her work. And today, Nigeria is one of the strongest Christian areas in Africa, sending missionaries around the world. Turning now to Asia, we've already seen how the work in India was actually opposed by colonial powers to begin with. Soon enough, as the British Empire expanded through South Asia, gospel workers continued to enter every city that had a military garrison, bringing Western education and moral teaching along with the message of Christ, modeled after the work of a Scottish missionary, Alexander Duff. The work in China and Japan had been opened through gunboat diplomacy. The British government wanted to sell opium to Chinese markets, but the emperor's nephew died from a drug overdose, so he opposed it. England declared war, and after the Opium War of 1840, the Chinese government was forced to open 5 treaty ports for Western commerce and missionary activity. A number of missionaries took advantage of these cities and went to China. Most confined their work to the ports in nearby districts, further identifying the gospel with Western colonialists. Karl Gutzlaff, who lived from 1803 to 1855, originally served in Indonesia under the Netherlands Missionary Society, but he transferred to China in 1833. During the Opium War, he served as an interpreter due to his fluency in Chinese. His strategy was to train Chinese nationals as evangelists, and in 6 years he recruited about 300 workers and distributed thousands of New Testaments, tracts, and Bibles. He baptized 2,871 converts. Later, however, it was discovered that his evangelists were in league with the printers. The evangelists would take the literature to the printer to say that it had been distributed, and then the printer would resell the same Bibles to Gutzlaff, saying that they were new orders. So they just kept recycling the same literature. He contributed to the founding of the China Evangelization Society, the CES, which was the organization that hired a fresh young recruit in 1854, a man by the name of Hudson Taylor. Hudson Taylor was saved at 17 and began medical training. He wanted to be a missionary doctor and began to train himself by living by faith, by not eating or earning a salary so he could be prepared for the hardships of work in the field. He arrived in China in 1854 with the CES, but resigned due to what he saw as poor administration. Bad health forced him to return to England, and while recovering, he decided to start a new type of mission organization. In 1865, he founded the China Inland Mission. He was determined to penetrate all of China with the gospel, thus the name Inland. He accepted single women and candidates with little formal schooling as missionaries. The China Inland Mission grew rapidly, became the first and prototypical quote-unquote faith mission. Forbidden to solicit financial support, all missionaries had to live by faith, adopt Chinese dress, master the Chinese language, and identify with the Chinese people. By 1882, the China Inland Mission had deployed 641 missionaries to each of China's provinces, and by 1914 it was the largest Protestant missions organization in the world. His approach inspired the development of similar faith mission agencies, and over 40 new organizations were organized, including the Sudan Interior Mission, now SIM, the Africa Inland Mission, the Heart of Africa Mission, the Unevangelized Fields Missions, and the North Africa Mission, and the Christian and Missionary Alliance. 50 years after the Opium Wars had opened China to missionary efforts, the Boxer Rebellion was both a reaction to and an escalation of colonialism in China. As Western influence controlled the Chinese economy at the end of the 19th century, many blamed the Christian movement, politically tied with Western powers, for their suffering. The Righteous and Harmonious Fists, dubbed the Boxers by the Western press, began attacking Christians, both missionaries and national believers, in the late 1890s. 135 Protestant missionaries and 53 children of missionaries died as martyrs in the Boxer Rebellion. Most of those killed were related to the work of the China Inland Mission. Another pioneer in China was Lottie Moon. It is difficult for Southern Baptists to think about missions without thinking of Charlotte Diggs or Lottie Moon. She was the first single woman missionary sent by the Foreign Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention. She was appointed to serve in Tengchao and Pingtu, China. Born and raised in Virginia from a wealthy, well-educated family famous for Confederate spies, she started her ministry as a teacher in Kentucky before going to China. Once there, she did women's work, meaning she worked to make disciples of women and children. But after disagreeing with some of her colleagues over mission strategy, she moved to start the work in a new area. In 1888, she wrote back to the churches in America suggesting that an offering be taken up to send help to join her in the field, and enough money was raised to send 3 more ladies to China. She continued her work in China during a time of famine, giving her food to others, and she literally starved to death, dying on a boat returning her to the United States on Christmas Eve in 1912. In the Americas, we want to start with David Brainerd, who lived 1718 to 1747, so obviously he falls outside of the 19th century, but I thought he was worth mentioning as an example of those sharing the gospel in the Americas, even before William Carey became the father of the modern missions movement. As a matter of fact, Brainerd's life had a strong motivating impact on Carey's desire to reach the nations. Brainerd was raised in a Christian home, but had a deep spiritual conversion experience when he was a young man. He went to Yale University, where he was expelled for questioning the salvation of his teachers. He began working to reach the Native American communities, first in New York and later in Pennsylvania. Eventually, he became too sick to continue, probably with tuberculosis, and he went to Northampton, Massachusetts to recover in the home of Jonathan Edwards. He died there at the age of 29. His journals were published first in 1746, and ever since then they have been an inspiration to generations of believers and missionaries around the world. The final missionary we want to consider today is George Lele. He lived from 1750 to 1828. He was born into slavery and became a Christian at the age of 23. He began preaching to other slaves almost immediately, and his passion and calling were so powerful that his owner, a Baptist deacon by the name of Henry Sharp, granted him freedom so that he could be fully committed to ministry. He was a powerful voice during the Great Awakening. One of the first people who came to Christ during his ministry was a childhood friend, David George, with whom we started this conversation. In 1775, Lele became the first ordained African-American pastor in America. 2 years later, he went on to found the first African-American Baptist church in North America in Savannah, Georgia, a church that is still active today. When Sharp died in the Revolutionary War, his family tried to re-enslave Lele, so he left America and went to Kingston, Jamaica in 1782. He faced persecution and was imprisoned for sedition, but in spite of all that, he continued to preach the gospel, and after 8 years, he had baptized 500 people. Between 1814 and 1832, the number of Baptists in Jamaica grew from 8,000 to over 20,000. As I say, this is just a quick introduction, not even a fair introduction to the people that I've mentioned, and so many hundreds of others who weren't mentioned. So never lose interest in learning about these great men and women of God that He has used from all nations to all nations for His glory. I hope you'll enjoy reading a biography, and maybe it will inspire you to continue reading missions biographies if that's not already a habit. Hopefully that's been a helpful introduction to what happened in the 19th century, and our next session we're going to be looking at the 20th century. God bless.